to make those sorts of commitments real in real life. And I've spent the last year and a half or 2 years trying to play around with some of the intersections between politics and technology in a way that I think is a little bit different than what's come before. So I'm going to be talking about democratizing surveillance for the next, until Kevin drags me off the stage or somebody asks me a question. Are there any questions before I continue? Kevin really meant it, and why not? Let's do it. I'm Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick. I'm at the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham and at the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego in California, where I live. And this is my @Twitter, @Instagram, @Gmail, so I'm @Choi-Fitz anywhere. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about democratizing surveillance because this is a screenshot from a video. About 5 years ago, I was a professor at a Central European University in Budapest. It's a George Soros's shop, which is just decamped to Vienna, for those of you who are following those Central European politics. And there's a large protest against a proposed tax on the internet. And I was running a sort of innovative rights lab at the time, and I asked my students, let's do something fun. What should we do? We can write policy reports. Let's do something that's a little bit more engaging with new technology. So we decided we were going to use drones to estimate the size of crowds. And we waited for crowds to come along. We waited for crowds to come along. And sort of democratic furor in Hungary was at an all-time low until the prime minister decided to tax the internet at $1 per gigabyte for everybody, for businesses, for grannies, and for young people. So just across the board tax on the internet. So lots and lots of people showed up. This raised an interesting question then about, well, how many people actually showed up? If you look at, I'm a sociologist, if you look at the sort of takes that most of my colleagues, my last book was a sort of an ethnography, an interview-based study. The data we tend to gather tends to be at the person by person or large, sort of large groups. We have lots of survey data, but we don't often have data that looks like this. This issue made it to the front of the New York Times and got us thinking, actually, it's a huge debate. I have another slide in another talk that has Trump's data side by side and filling up the lawn. But that seems dated now and a little sad. So the question here is, in that event and at this event, how many people are actually in the crowd? So we started gathering data, started gathering large bodies of data on large crowds and developed an estimation method for establishing exactly how many people are in a large crowd. We did this in a very sort of a manual and low-tech way, in a way that you essentially can get enumerators, give them about 20 minutes with a coding set and 20 minutes with the methodology, and we've got great intercoder reliability numbers, and they can estimate about how many people there are at this event. The answer is about 36,500. So this got a larger question going in my mind about, so if this is how we were using drones, this is all drone-based technology that came out of this human rights lab. So then the question becomes, okay, so what else are drones used for? And so over the last 3-4 years, I've been working on a book that essentially maps the way that drones get used to change politics on the ground. And then from there, it led to questions like, well, how do satellites, how do lots of other ways of Earth observation, other ways of seeing what's happening on the ground, change politics on the ground, right? And I have a pretty broad idea about what politics is. For example, I think that graffiti, I think public art has a political element because it does things like challenge institutional norms around advertising, right? This is what is he? A drone graffiti artist, a performance artist named Katsu, who this is the first drone-based graffiti defacing of a large advertising platform. So drones all of a sudden change politics around what we can see, where we can actually project politics and power, right? So all of a sudden we have new questions like, if we can actually see reliably and over time new things in the kiln industry, right, in India, what does that mean for politics on the ground? What does this mean for local governments who should have actually been gathering this data in the first place? It's an accountability mechanism for folks who really should have had these numbers all along, right? So the question I've got is not what can we do with technology? That's an interesting question. But actually, what does this actually mean for politics on the ground? And one of the things it means is that technology changes politics. We know this. We knew this because the day after I showed you that picture when the individuals holding up their cell phones to our drone, I could have spent a minute and talked there about that image. We coordinated with the community organizers of that protest so that everyone who was in that protest would turn their phones on bright and would point them up at our drone. That was the image that got captured by the AFP reporter for the New York Times, right? So having a new way of observing what the crowd was doing changed what the crowd actually did. So what I'm pointing to is a sort of iterative process and ebb and flow. So we're talking about how do we see new things with new tools and new instruments that we have on a human rights issue we care a lot about. And my point is that this actually has a recursive effect that I'll talk about more in a minute. So the first thing is new technology, like, I keep pointing at Doreen, satellites, sorry, point at both of you, like satellites, democratize surveillance, right? So the drone that we use and the drones that others are using in this sort of way to document human rights violations are incredibly affordable. I teach in a school of engineering in addition to the School of Peace Studies, and we have teams of students who build drones that cost about $100 that can do some of the stuff that we do now. Takes a couple of hours, they work in teams. I've got folks from the humanities doing this alongside folks with backgrounds in electrical engineering. The point is it democratizes the use of tools, and these tools can actually help us to see new things that matter for the sort of representational and rights-based issues that we care about. It also leads to tactical iteration. So if we have new ways of seeing things from the sky, how will that change things on the ground? For example, when we were doing this stuff when we were flying these drones and documenting protests in Budapest, the local embassy, which was brand new because after 9/11, embassies all over the world hardened themselves against land-based attacks, right? Were completely vulnerable against something like our drone, right? There's nobody given any thought to what do you do if drones can, if devices can actually be flown over buildings like embassies. So it leads to a whole nother wave of decisions about how things on the ground happen. For example, we're going to hear about the slavery from space issue. The question then becomes, if folks know they're being overflown, rights violators know they're being overflown, what's their next step, right? This is why having folks on the grassroots and on the ground actually makes a huge difference because it helps to complement these two perspectives, right? How am I doing on time? I interviewed the inventor of the Predator drone for my book. And we had this long conversation about what he actually meant to be doing. And he wanted to impress on me as we were talking about the first use of his first prototype. It got mothballed. Nobody thought it would be useful. It was in the late 90s, got mothballed. Except during the lead up to the NATO action in Kosovo and following on the sort of challenges in Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, the CIA discovered that what the Serb forces were doing is killing people and burying them in mass graves and then covering them at night, right? And they were doing this at night until they discovered that they were getting overflown by satellites. And then they would do it during cloud cover, right? So step one in ethnic cleansing is bury the evidence. So the first round of evidence burying involved hiding at night. The next round involved, well, if there are satellites overflying the space, then actually what you go in this cloud cover. So his first version of the Predator was actually mothballed in the Mojave Desert, and it got taken out and repurposed, not armed, but just repurposed to fly under the clouds, so they could document these mass burial sites, right? So in some ways, this point's like an alternative history and in a sort of a more just and humane, history of the Predator, I guess. But it also points to the way in which there's this tactical sort of iteration as new technologies come online and as rights violators work to pivot in order to sustain whatever control and capacity they'd previously enjoyed. Another thing I could spend a lot of time talking about, Kevin's written a book about and knows a whole lot about, is that technology, and this was actually teased a bit in his first comments, is that technology and slavery have a long, long history, right? I'm not going to spend any time on this right now, but this is another thing for us to consider. We're all talking about how new tools and new technologies and new forms of data all together can combined help us to say new things about emancipation. But one of the things that we should also realize is that as technology evolves and evolves, slavery evolves with it. So we're having lots of conversations about new tools and new technology, and I'm echoing this iteration process, right? And technology matters both in terms of the modes of production, this is people being used in the sorts of ways that we tend to produce the things that we buy. So this is clear in supply chain issues and supply chain, sort of getting better data about exploitation in supply chains. But they're also sort of engaged in the means of exploitation, so involved in their own bodies and their own selves. I've tried to capture all of this stuff, not just from from the perspective of slavery and the anti-slavery movement, but in larger terms as I started my talk about politics and what does it mean if we have new tools that can allow us to see new things on the ground. In a new book called The Good Drone that's contracted with MIT Press, and the argument is essentially that there's technology used for way more things than social media. This is like a slide that I have because when I talk to broader audiences, I don't need to tell you all this because lots of the conversations we're having here are about developing and harnessing, leveraging data that lots of people would never ever see. But in the little world where I come from, which is around social movements, we often think that that communication and getting our word out there is the only thing that really matters. So in we like to think we're in an ivory tower. We're usually just in some small attic. So in the small attic of academia that I live in, this is something that we think is really important, Twitter. And I'm trying to argue with this book, actually we need to be looking at lots of other forms of technology, whether or not they ever make it into public. So I left this slide here because I wanted to say kudos to you all. This is a place where a slide like this isn't necessary, because I think we're really starting to see around the corner in terms of how data can be used and harnessed in ways that people might not ever see and is rarely recognized. And finally, the thing I want to leave you all with is that our technology is only as good as our ethics, right? And this point's been made several times in this brief morning that we've been together. Technology, we know that we have a garbage in, garbage out issue with our technology. If we have bad training sets, then we're going to get bad results. We know this. But this should also push us as we try to balance out the ratios we have of intelligence on the ground and local networks and local knowledge and the incredible new tools and tricks that we have for actually harnessing data, whether it's old or new. Cuneiforms, anybody going to take Kevin up on the machine coding of cuneiform? Do you have a team for that? Yes, there's a team for that. So we're taking names at the end if you want to join our cuneiform coding lab. I guess I said this already, but there's really not a patch, this is the name of the book, there's really not a patch. Tech is not a patch for political will, rule of law, broad commitments to equitable social, economic, and political systems. I think this has already been said, and I think it can't be said enough. So I'm going to finish here. Can I say one more thing? One last minute? Here's my one last thing. This is like now I wish I had a little record scratch button. I go, this is for something completely different. This new book is doing a really weird thing, which is it's going to go through it's been through peer review at MIT Press, which means it's actually been reviewed by other academics who are also living in small cupboards, who think that book is okay. But now that it's contracted, we're opening it up for open peer review on a platform called PubPub, which means any of you can read it right now, and you can forward it to anybody you want, and any of you all or anybody you want can actually comment on it and tell me if I'm doing it right or not. This is so crazy because it makes me very nervous because people are going to look at this thing in real time. Does that make sense? So this is actually going to then be a regular old, sort of a book that comes out. It's a book, and then it'll be a Kindle, but it'll also be a free PDF. So this is my little pitch around, I think, people should be free, and I also think knowledge should be free. And I think it should be free when it's produced, and I think it should be as inclusive and open as possible when it's actually made. Does that make sense? So if you don't mind taking a look at that and helping me to make this book better, suggest cases, start debates, tell me where I'm wrong, tell me how things can be better, I'd greatly appreciate it. Sweet.
Thank you, Austin. Fantastic. Any quick puzzlements that Austin, because he does talk fast, it's hard to keep up with him.
I'm sorry.
Any quick notions or issues or questions? Not so much? Okay. He's like that, confusing. So, Andrew. Actually, I think it's Doreen. Oh, is it? Sorry, Doreen. Me? Yeah, there we go. Sorry. Oh, you're right. I read it wrongly. Yeah, she was. You've been up before, so I won't do a long introduction either. Yeah, great.
You waiting for me? Okay, thank you, Kevin. No, I have to talk into this, don't I? Okay, so thank you for choosing this hothouse. It means a lot to me. So, as I say, the slavery from space as a concept grew out of the Rights Lab about 2 years ago. And you heard me this morning, and you heard Kevin talk about some of the work that we've been doing. But I will just reiterate that what we're trying to do with this particular project, and then I'll talk about what I would like to see from this particular hothouse, and hopefully you'll be able to contribute to that. So it is those sort of 3 levels of intelligence that we're getting from the big data that we can get from space now, from those satellites that are orbiting our Earth's surface. So it is that what we called tech truthing or sat truthing, where we know modern slavery is happening on the ground, but we need a little bit more information about what's going on, a bit of narrative around what's going on. That's the kind of first level. The second level is gap filling, so data gap filling with the data that we're getting from space. So, you know, we know that, for instance, with the brick kilns, that they use bonded labourers, but we don't quite know how many brick kilns there are. So let's use the satellite data to fill in that particular gap in the data on modern slavery prevalence. And last but not least, how do we then mine the data that we're collecting from our satellites to give us, again, more data, more intelligence, more information about what is happening around modern slavery. And I think the time is right to use space as a kind of final frontier for 8.7, simply because the data we're getting from satellites now is becoming sort of fully calibrated. And what I mean by that is that it's interchangeable between different satellite systems. So we have a calibrated data set over time and over space that we can exploit for this particular endeavor. The time is right, I think, now for 8.7. But we're not starting from, scratch. We are able and fortunate to use the learnings and the technology, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and paradigms that actually exist in other parts of the EO world and the artificial intelligence world. So these are just some of my retweets that I've got on Twitter, and I think this demonstrates my point. So we have AI for EO already. It might not be focusing on modern slavery per se, but it's using and thinking about how we use artificial intelligence along with the Earth observation data we're getting from space. And then we have another example of the drones, and in this particular initiative is looking at illegal mining. And it could be that that is using forced labour within that particular practice. So we've got the technology, we are using it already. It's just about how we, focus the lens on modern slavery. And the bottom example there is using RadarSat, which is a microwave-based system, to detect fishing boats, which again could be using modern slaves. And what we have here is the knowledge that these fishing boats tend to have some metal on them, and that reflects back microwave data really, really well, and we can have a system for monitoring the movements of those fishing vessels. So I would argue that the work that we've been doing so far within the lab is kind of focused on what we've got on this slide here. We've got the 3 parts that we've been working with, and that is the data that's been captured by the satellite systems. We've been using citizen science, and we've been using some artificial intelligence techniques, and all together we've been able to improve our estimation of modern slavery prevalence. But actually, that's not the whole story at all. And what I want to try and find out and push forward is what are the other parts that we need to be able to improve our modern slavery prevalence estimations. Is it satellite companies like Planet that will really push this agenda forward? Who are the other actors who should be involved? How do we engage with those on the ground, with the NGOs that really have intelligence about what's going on, but perhaps don't have the intelligence about how we use the data from space. So I'm hoping that you'll have a few ideas around this. So what I'm going to do now is just focus on some examples from the Rights Lab to give you some, hopefully, some food for thought. So we are at a time where what we call the spatial resolution of the data from space is as fine as it's ever been. And Andrew will be able to say whether it's going to get even finer. So this is the sort of data set we can get. Each one of the pixels, if I was to zoom in to this particular image, is around 1 meter by 1 meter. Can anyone tell me, given what Kevin talked about and what I've talked about, what we're looking for here in terms of infrastructure associated with modern slavery? Yeah, brick kilns, brilliant. Okay, so we have some brick kilns. Austin, can you point to one? There you go, yeah, okay. So, so the way we've been able to map our the brick kilns right across the brick belt of South Asia, which we know use bonded labourers, is we've been able to train the machine to look for these particular kilns. But as I say, there could be other instances of modern slavery within our imagery that we don't know what we're looking for. So, how do we get to a point where we're automatically extracting the features of interest? And the high-resolution data are so high that you can start to look at things like, dumper trucks in quarries. So here's some examples here. The machinery that sorts out the what's been quarried. We can really get to the kind of extraction of features, but how do we know which features are going to be important to enable us to improve our estimates of modern slavery, right down to that micro level? These images that we can see exist in what we call the visible part of the spectrum. You get a photograph-like image back. But actually, data from space is more than that. We can move into the invisible part of the spectrum. We can improve our temporal resolution. We can monitor things over time. So this is an example of that, it just so happens to be using planet data that Andrew will talk to you about. The key thing with this data is that the resolution spatially isn't quite as good as what we've been looking at. It's 3 meter instead of 1 meter resolution. But the data are daily. It's updated daily and it's global. That is a fantastic step forward for remote sensing and Earth observation as a whole, but also for modern slavery, the modern slavery agenda. So what we've got here is cotton harvesting, which uses forced labor in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and so on. And we've got a false color image, so it's not quite what you see in terms of the photograph, but the red fields are fully, the cotton is ready to be harvested. The blue field, the cotton's still growing. And what we can do is track over time this same area, and we go forward from June to October, and you can see there's far more red in the imagery. So what we can do now is start to track when the fields go from red to blue. Something like this. So the image before and the image after. And we can start to track how long that took and whether there's any evidence of mechanization. And that tells us if there isn't evidence of mechanization and the timing is quite slow, that there could be forced labor being used here. And then that tells you, well, let's deploy a satellite over that area that is of high resolution, and then we may be able to detect features that tell us forced labour is being used, i.e. buses that are shipping people in to these areas to pick the cotton. This is another example that Kevin talked about earlier, and what we've got here again, this is the mapping of the fish processing farms in the Sundarbans Reserve Forest. And we were able to look at the Google archive, which only goes back 20 years or so, to map these fish processing camps. However, we were interested in actually how dynamic are these and what's happening going forward. And again, with the planet data, we've been able to do that. So if we look at this particular area that is using child slaves and focus here, we can see the very high resolution data and then the associated planet data, which is updated daily. And that's really important because of cloud cover in these areas to be able to get a higher frequency of capture so that we get a cloud-free image. And if we go through, what you can start to see is a shrimp pool being built and then being used. So we can start to monitor features within these areas that are, we think, using modern slaves. And last but not least, we have a big data set that is an archive now going back 50 years, and all of that is from space, and in this particular case using Landsat data, we can go back through the archive to generate a better understanding of why and where slavery might be happening. So in this particular case, we just use the archive and use a signal processing method to see where the breaks were for each of the kilns in the brick belt that we've mapped, and that allows us to age those kilns. So, artificial intelligence, that's all about looking for patterns in big data. And that's essentially what we're doing, but the data set is a continuous raster data set over time and over space because we've got that calibration happening. So what is the best artificial intelligence method to use? We don't know. Are there artificial intelligence techniques that need to be developed using these particular data for this particular application? How do we optimally use this Earth observation big data to tackle SDG 8.7? So do we need to develop a system of systems to allow us to get a better idea of what's going on in terms of modern slavery? And maybe Andrew will be able to tell us how that might happen. Cool. Thank you.
No, I think there's a question, and I think they're going to swap laptops over there.
Oh, okay. Well, while you're doing that, first the question. Yeah. Was there a question?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. So you're looking at industries that have a large percentage of reports of forced labor and everything, and I'm just wondering, how do you deal with that sort of last 10%, right? Because even at 30 centimeters per pixel, you know, Worldview 4 or whatever, you're not going to be able to see the difference between that dump truck driver being paid and the dump truck driver being a forced laborer. So are there proxy indicators that indicate the use of forced labor, for example, maybe larger fields being harvested than you could get with paid labor or something like that? How do you get that last 10% of certainty?
I don't know. You tell me. No.
Okay.
That is the hard part. I would argue that the big data that we're getting from space and the expertise that we have is the easy part.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. How do we go from here's a brick kiln, there are 100 people working under forced labour conditions. That is the tricky part. So what do we look at? Do we look at the I think we have to get a really good understanding from NGOs on the ground what features might be. And you talked about the dump trucks. Maybe we're looking at quarries that don't have dumper trucks in them, and that tells you, well, if we can see the quarry getting bigger, or we can use other satellite technologies like INSAR, which tells you whether the ground is moving. Well, if that's happening, but there are no dumper trucks there, well, how is this happening? Maybe it's being done by hand. So I think we have to be really quite intelligent about how we use this data. Absolutely, great question.
There's another question back there.
Hi, it's actually builds on that. So, by the way, I really like Rights Lab. I really was unaware of what you guys were doing. It's really fantastic. Is there a play with policy? I mean, if you think about nuclear test ban treaty monitoring, you try to identify when things are happening, then build a policy framework which you can go in with inspectors and say something is going on here. Is there some play that you've explored in that direction?
Again, this is the hard part. I see all of this as further evidence of, to layer on top of other data that we have about a particular situation. I don't think we can, in some ways, people have reported that, slave masters, holders or whatever can't hide because these data are, underpinned by physical principles. You can manipulate it, but you can backtrack and, you can go back to the original data. So I think it's a very powerful tool, but I think it has to be used with intelligence, sensitively, to, go that last mile and then, change things for the better.
Another question there, yes.
Hi, so I have two questions. I would try to make it really short. The first question is, it's not necessarily related to slavery, but there are organized crimes in Latin America where they have illegal mining, and I feel like technology like this can be used to identify those illegal mines. Has that been, I'm guessing you're nodding.
Wait 2 minutes.
Okay, perfect. And the second question is, has there been ever like a backlash due to like privacy issues?
Not to me personally, but to EO data and Google Street View, all of that remotely sent data that's then served up on a platform for anyone to see. Absolutely, there has been. So again, we have to think about ethics. We have to think about sensitivity here. And we have a map of every single brick kiln now, but there's no way we're going to put that up on the web for everybody to, So we have to engage with those actors that will use those data for good.
Thank you.
Doreen, may I put them on this? Is that all the questions? I wanted to just add a couple of things. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Sorry, that prompted another question, what you just said, Doreen. This is Hannah and from Tech Against Trafficking, and I was just wondering about the due diligence that you're actually conducting on your potential partners. How are you establishing if it is a good actor that will use this data for the right purposes or that might use it for either intentionally bad purposes or unintentionally have negative consequences?
No, you're absolutely right. This is where we have, the work we're doing in the Rights Lab, we have partnerships. And, we haven't quite got to the stage where we're giving out the brick kiln map, but that's the next stage. And we have to be very, very careful about what happens. A good example is we've managed to find a big tree in the data sets we have. Nothing to do with slavery. This was, we found a big tree. So we wanted to make a news splash about that. Great. But then we were told, don't put the location of that big tree in your news, your new press releases, because that's a big tree. That's an awful lot of wood in that tree. Someone can use that information for purposes other than you would like. So absolutely, due diligence is really important.
Hannah, that's a good question, and it's actually something that I had flagged up for us to talk at the end. Andrew and I were talking about that those at lunchtime as well. I'm going to say two quick things just for backfill information. One is about the question about the concerns about privacy invasion and so forth. What's interesting under international airspace law is that you're free to take pictures from space. You're not necessarily free to take pictures from an airplane, but you're free to take pictures from space. There's a movement, certainly in the UK at the moment, called the Airspace Tribunal, which is bringing together a lot of legal actors to explore whether or not there should be, in fact, a UN convention or an international convention that begins to reach up past the atmosphere to determine about our privacy concerns that exist above the atmosphere. But at the moment, you can feel aggrieved about it, but you can't do anything about it legally. And the second thing I just wanted to say about the dump truck driver is a quick word about the economics of slavery. One of the things that broke through my consciousness about this very early on in my own research was when I found a whole series of families in hereditary forms of slavery in India, and they were making sand with hammers. And the person who controlled them, who owned them, was selling sand. Now, think about the ubiquitous nature of sand and the fact that the only way that you can sell handmade sand at a profit is probably to have absolutely free labor, and in fact, very poorly fed labor as well. And so one of the key things that Doreen already alluded to is the fact that when we look across so many types of work, when you look at them and there's an absence of machinery, that's an indicator. So if there's a dump truck, maybe not. If there's no dump truck, then it's a possibility. And if you've ever been in one of these brick kilns that we've been looking at from satellites, they're fundamentally the same types of brick making. If you ever read the Christian Bible, or the old, in the book of Exodus about what the Jews had to do for the Egyptians when they were in slavery, it was basically make bricks like this. So we're talking about handwork, virtually no tools beyond shovels, right? So that's one of the key things about this, is that in a sense, mechanization is almost an enemy of enslavement, and it might bring other types of exploitation with it, but in many ways it becomes a possibility. Though there's an interesting sub-story about this, about some of the areas where Austin's worked, where freed slaves have got their own mineral leases, but are now being pushed out by investors who can bring in industrial equipment that they can't afford with capital. So let me hand back now to Andrew. And great. Yeah, off you go.
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? Well, first of all, it's a great honor and privilege to be here with all of you. I come from the worlds of aerospace and Silicon Valley, where we're pioneering some really significant new technologies that we hope to put in service to all of you. Can I just ask, out of curiosity, how many sort of tech-savvy people are there in the room? Okay, all right, and how many people working in applied human rights and slavery work are in the room? I'm just trying to get a sense. It's really good. That's about 50-50. That's great. So turn to your neighbor. Don't leave without introducing yourselves to the person sitting next to you. Yeah, I think that's terrific. Well, that's what we're here to do, and so I'm very keen to share with you a little bit of this story. And before I do, I wanted to share just two very sort of meta observations. So much of the work we do in human rights work. Well, let me back up. I'm Andrew Zolli. I oversee what we call the Global Impact Portfolio at Planet. So I oversee the is everyone else's lights flickering, or is that just in my head? Because I think I'm having a stroke. Okay, so I oversee all of our humanitarian, human rights, sustainable development, all of what we call our global impact portfolio, all our social impact portfolio. I asked them to dim the lights because I'm going to show you some things on screen, and it would be better for you to see them in a higher contrast environment, but you can use this opportunity to nap if you feel so inclined, because we're at 2:17 p.m., the peak learning hour of the day, as I think you all know. So one of the things that's really fascinating in general about, we are positioning this discussion within the context of the SDG framework. But what's particularly interesting about the actual indicators that drive so many of the SDGs is how many of them are really who, what, when, and where problems. They're really fixing in time and space, in geography and in person, phenomena that are happening. You see, in general, you can't fix what you can't see. And for the majority of the people in this room who are working at the forefront of slavery and human rights, the challenge is that so much of this is invisible. And it's therefore not particularly salient. It's not salient to human cognition. We don't naturally look at it and see it happening in front of us and say, I understand what I'm looking at. So our firm was actually started with the mission to use space to help life on Earth. We are a very interesting organization. We were co-founded by a group of NASA scientists with that mission, not to go to other places, but to essentially hold a mirror back upon the planet. And we think that every tool, a tool of discovery, is also not just a tool of scientific discovery, but also of moral discovery. And so we've built a kind of giant mirror reflected back upon the planet that allows us to see the behavior of change of the planet on a daily basis. So let me just tell you a little bit about that. So hi, again. Our mission as an organization is to image the whole Earth every day. And the way we do that is we've launched the largest constellation of Earth-observing satellites in history. In fact, actually, in the entire history of human beings putting things into space, if you look at the organizations that lead, the organization that's put up the most satellites ever in history is the American government, and then after them is the Russians, and after them are the Chinese, and after them is Planet. And we've just gotten started, so we're going to swamp all those people. We're like really, really seriously good at putting things in space. But the idea is not just to take pretty pictures, but to make change visible, accessible, and actionable. And that's really affixing in time and space those who, what, when, where, why kinds of, well, it's actually who, what, when, and where so we can get to why. Right, and that's really the critical observation. So this is a story, speaking of satellites. How many people here work in satellites? Exactly, 1. Okay, well, you can tell everybody about this. Maybe 2. Actually, I take that back. So that's really good. 3, 4. Oh, it's started. This is a bad example. This is a bad data set to be sampling from. But let me just say, for those of you who don't work in aerospace, just a word or two about satellites. So normally, they're the size of school buses. This is a typical Earth observation satellite, just to give you a sense of how big it is. There's actually 2 people crawling on it up there in the rafters. They cost hundreds of millions to billions of dollars to make, to design and plan and build and operate. And as a consequence, they have historically been the provenance of governments, and especially military and then a little bit of industry. But because there haven't been very many of them, they've been very expensive. Just a simple supply and demand curve means that they've been the provenance of the wealthy and the privileged. And as a consequence, for the kinds of things that we want to do with them, which is often put them in the service of the most disadvantaged people on the planet, the people who are most structurally disadvantaged, it's just been impossible. So a group of you, and one of the challenges about this is because they take literally decades sometimes to plan and build and hundreds of millions of billions of dollars to make. If you're a young engineer and you're going to work on them, you might get to work on 2 or 3 in your entire career. So a group of young NASA engineers said, we don't really want to do this. This is not the way we like to operate. And they were working in the part of NASA that's based in Silicon Valley. So they went down to Best Buy. Do you all know what Best Buy is? And they bought a stack of these things. And they took them back to the lab, and they took them apart, and they built a tiny little satellite out of the innards of one of these devices, about the sort of thing you could hold in the palm of your hand. And they gave it to one of the astronauts who's headed to the International Space Station in a month or 2 and asked her to throw it out the airlock to see how your phone would do in space. And it turns out your phone does great in space. And if it's shielded correctly, it has a camera, a computer, a GPS, radio. It has a lot of the big equipment that these big instruments have. And this is actually the mechanics of, as Austin mentioned, democratizing surveillance. This is actually how it happens. It's because we spent trillions of dollars on Earth making these little devices small and efficient and powerful. And then when you make them small and efficient and powerful, you can make satellites that look totally different. So these satellites are only about the size of a loaf of bread. They're quite small. Because many of these previous satellites come from the military, they often have names for like birds of prey. There's a lot of hawks and talons, and we call it the angry birds phenomena. They want to kind of come down, swoop, and kill you. So ours are called doves. They're a name for birds of peace. They're covered in artwork. We have artists from all over the world who actually make artwork that ensconces our satellites. And what we do with them is this. We put them in a specialized orbit. So can I ask you your name? Jessica. So let's imagine Jessica's the sun, here's the Earth, some grade school physics, this one goes around the other one, this one orbits Jessica, and it spins on a daily basis, and as it does, we have a group of these hundreds of satellites that spin over the North Pole, down over the equator, between the sun and the Earth, then down over the South Pole and up over the dark side of the Earth, and as the Earth turns sideways underneath them, they image the entire surface of the planet every day. And we actually have 2 of these constellations, one that does the whole Earth at 3 meters per pixel. So we're not reading anybody's newspaper. That's not our goal. In fact, the question was asked about privacy. The design parameters of the mission were specifically chosen to avoid personal privacy considerations while allowing us to see systemic change. Then we have 15 of these much higher resolution satellites. They image at about 70 centimeters per pixel, a little bit bigger than the chair that you're sitting on. Again, not enough to read your newspaper, but enough to see much more detail, but not everywhere every day. Those ones have to be pointed. And often what we do is we use signals found in the 3-meter data to automatically orient satellites. So the first time we see a smoke plume of a forest fire, we zoom in and take pictures. Or the first time we see boats that have turned off their AIS signal, the normal radio transponder, we can zoom in and take a signal. We can only do that by combining this extraordinary level of planetary data. This is the biggest of big data. It's terabytes of data a day, many terabytes of data a day, with the tools of artificial intelligence, because there's not nearly enough people on the Earth. In fact, we had people from one of our customers estimated, they did a simple calculation that if they were gonna look at the Amazon every day, it would take a population of 6 million people to actually do the daily observation of all of the satellite imagery. So you literally can't do this without satellite imagery. Now we have, believe it or not, 800 on average, about 800 observations for every place upon the Earth. And that's really important because what we want to understand when we want to look for new signals is we want to understand the normal variability of that place so that we can begin to understand what's abnormal variability, because that's the stuff we want to pay attention to. Now, here's just an example. The next thing we do in terms of using artificial intelligence, can you guys go backwards for a second? Let me see if I could just hit the back button, because there we go. Okay, so this is me clicking on a solar installation in China, okay, and me pulling out and finding every solar installation in China. So that's what the combination of this data and trained algorithms can do. So here's me kind of zooming in, just looking at a very gross level for features that are consistent. So if you wanted to understand the current flow or the current growth of, say, clean energy installations in China, this would be the mechanism to do it. Now, in fact, actually, what's really interesting is the Chinese now know we can do this. Someone asked this question about adjustments. In fact, the Chinese have started to build solar installations that are only legible from space, actually. These are these pandas. I think they're making them for us, basically, right now. Okay, but what's particularly interesting is to think about the ways in which prior technologies transformed the world so significantly. And I'll just use Google as an example. What did Google do? They indexed the internet on a continuous basis. They figured out how to index the digital space and then put it behind a breakthrough user interface that everybody could use without a lot of training. What Planet's doing is we're indexing the planet every day, and we're going to put that behind a user interface so that you can ask questions of it, like how much deforestation has happened in this particular area? What's the growth of the number of buildings? What ships are where, and where should they be? And those are critical pre-indicators often of issues associated with slavery. So this is what we think is coming, something like a search bar for the planet. Let me show you just a really quick example. I took one of those phenomena that is often associated with, in many cases with slavery, and that's deforestation. And I want to show you this. This is sped up. This is about 5 months of deforestation. We lose something like 40 football fields a minute of forests around the world. I mean, it's unbelievable, the rate of change. So let me just show you what you're seeing here. On the right, I don't know if this will allow me to zap. This is what you can actually see the clearing of the fields that's happening here. But the thing to pay attention to is this, okay? Because do you see that little looks like spider webs? That's the illegal roads that go in before you can take the logs out. And we've interdicted hundreds of thousands of hectares of illegal deforestation in the Amazon by being able to identify the thing that reliably happens before that activity occurs. So we're going to move from reactive, which is what happened before, how do we forensically reconstruct the past, to something like much more like real-time monitoring. But the ultimate promise of some of these tools is predictive, the ability to see the things that reliably happen before. Now, the challenge is you can only do that if you really understand the phenomena you're looking at. This one's easy, but the more sophisticated signals are the ones that actually the organizations on the ground that are represented in this room are the stewards of. Your ground truth data, when combined with this satellite imagery, holds unbelievable promise. You actually hold some of the most important information. The satellite imagery might be worthless without the things that these organizations hold. Okay, so we do a lot of work around the SDGs. This data is directly relevant for measuring 12 of the 17 goals. Someone asked a question about mining. So this is actually along a, this is in Peru. This is along the Malinowski River. It actually borders the Madre de Dios. It's a big park, and let me just show you the thing that's particularly interesting is beginning to understand forensically, because we can look at these phenomena all around the world, the kind of systems heuristics. What happens when you provide a legal mining concession to an organization? So what you see here is legal mining, and this is the mining camp for the workers, and this is just a few months later. This is this is July. Sorry, I take that back. So this is, sorry, I'm trying to go backwards, but I can't. This is what happened between July and November in that system. So that's illegal gold mining, heavily influenced in that particular case by forced and bonded labor. And we can actually see the phenomena in real time. We can actually measure that on a daily basis. And we can begin to estimate, as we did here, at which point the river actually ruptures. The river that's used to pan for the gold is actually washed away. And in this instance, this imagery made it to the front page of the largest daily newspaper and caused the Peruvian, the Coast Guard to actually come up the river and destroy all of these illegal activity, all of the illegal infrastructure. So we do lots of other work. This is just an example in Indonesia, where the satellites automatically detect, we trained algorithms to look for shipping vessels. So we're just looking through all the imagery continuously and identifying every ship on the planet everywhere, every day. And as we do that, we can actually then, when we find a signal, automatically task the higher resolution satellites to go in and find this is a particular ship-to-ship transfer that's happening of the illegal fishing catch, which is so strongly associated, I think in the prior session we heard, with slave labor and with enforced labor. Being able to see where all the ships are, regardless of where they're broadcasting from, because all the ships are required to broadcast with something called an AIS transponder. When they do something illegal, they turn it off, but they can't evade our detection. And what's particularly interesting is because we're capturing the whole world every day, we saw where the ships were yesterday and the day before that. We can reverse engineer all of their movements back to port. So we can see exactly the time that they left. And that is just about isolating down the signal that then people can use to say, okay, we know it happened on this day. So how many vessels actually left? Right? So it's just taking the world and compressing it. And someone else asked a question about policy and the relationship between these technologies and policy. I will tell you that the UN Security Council has just started using exactly this technology from Planet to monitor North Korea for sanctions violations. And that's a situation in which a change in behavior and capability drives a change in policy. And again, we're just at the beginning of these things. I'll give you a couple more examples. This is what it looks like when you do that at the port level. I'm going to just give you this. This is a port. This is the port of Beirut. This is me looking for every ship over the course of a couple of weeks. This is from the beginning of September. This is about a month. So then this is me zooming in and saying, okay, tell me about that ship right there. So this kind of capability in the hands of human rights and anti-slavery defenders. Can you imagine what we're going to be able to do? What's going to happen is we're going to take a gigantic step forward, but only if we really work together. Okay, just quick two examples. Sorry, I'm like 9 time zones ahead of you, and it's like 3 in the morning, and I'm completely exhausted. So I really appreciate. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So I just want to talk about cocoa beans. 70% of the world's chocolate is grown in 2 countries. It's grown in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. By far and away, the larger of those two countries is in Ivory Coast. Much of that harvesting and plantation of cocoa. So I had this experience where I really worked on this use case, and then my kids wanted to go out and buy a chocolate bar, and I looked at the stand in a completely different way. This is in the Haute-Sassande. This is a forest preserve in Côte d'Ivoire, and this is actually a function of conflict. So this is levels of deforestation prior to the conflicts that were around 2016, during the conflicts, and then as that loosened governance, suddenly you saw this mass plantation. Much of it done with child slave laborers who are imported from other francophone regional former colonies. The thing that's interesting is right within the Haute-Sassande, this is some of them blurred out, we can actually see the deforestation occurring. If you look sort of like right here, just watch that, right? So this is over the course of 3 weeks. So we actually can watch the correlates of human behavior at scale from space in a way that once we understand what we're looking at, we can begin to understand where they occur in time. And then with other forensic data, we can begin to map the supply routes of that material out of those places and into the global supply chain, which is actually what you see here. Okay, we're doing that with human trafficking and with mass migration generally. I just wanted to end on this note before I offer a couple of closing thoughts. We've trained algorithms, for instance, that can identify roads and buildings, and we use them for tracking populations in refugee camps around the world. And in the process, we have very good proxy counts. And one of the important ethical challenges there is that we often find refugee camps using artificial intelligence and this kind of imagery that are not on any official map, and it's unclear whether or not people want to be found. So we don't actually release that data to the public. Someone asked this question about what are the ethics of release, and I will tell you that we have a very robust ethics process that we continually refine and improve, and a big part of it is working with institutional partners who have similar data ethics policies, but also have the domain expertise to understand what could and should be released. In fact, actually, this is a picture from our own country. This is the migrant detention facility back in Tornillo, Texas, where the current presidential administration has been separating children from their families. This is in June when they said they were going to cease that policy. I don't know if you remember, they said they were going to suspend that policy. This is actually from September. This is 3 months after they said they were going to stop that policy. You can see all of the growth continuing. This is work, we have a comprehensive relationship with Human Rights Watch. We're sort of incubating a lot of this work with HRW. And they're being able to do things that we think are just amazing. So I just wanted to offer a couple of things, ways to think. Not so much specific solutions, but this gives you a taste of the kinds of things that we're talking about in the future. So the first one is just basically providing evidence. And it's usually not all the evidence, it's supporting evidence. And most importantly, it's not just evidence of, but it's sometimes evidence against. In a surprising number of cases, what we found is that the satellite imagery disconfirms a hypothesis because many of us we've calibrated the human rights and slavery space to work with information deficits. So we use a lot of hunches all the time, and hunches are wrong often. It doesn't mean they're wrong all the time, but it means that if we want to maintain credibility in our ability, we have to be accurate, and we have to put a very high bar on rigor. So one of the things that these tools are going to do is they are going to both increase our ability to do false detections and false positive detections. And they're going to increase the rigor that is going to be expected of this space. I think that's one thing to understand. We think it's happening, and no, we know for certain that it's happening, and we can't therefore afford to get it wrong by misascribing something is going to go up as a function of these new technologies. A second one is just enhancing the targets of engagement. There aren't enough of us to intervene in all of the systems. So the question is, where do we intervene? Where do we get the greatest outcome with our limited human resources and our limited political capital? This is going to be able to guide human behavior in a significant way. A third one is one that I think Kevin may have talked about earlier, but really understanding the kind of epidemiology of these. What are the things that are continuously associated with other things that are associated with the things we care about? So for instance, I showed you in the deforestation example, finding the pre-trigger gives you some sense of where and when you might want to intervene in a system before it gets too late. We don't really understand the forensic epidemiological modeling of many of these phenomena. We only understand them retrospectively. We're going to begin to build operational models that can guide behavior on a forward-looking basis. And that means moving to a more predictive model, which I mentioned. Being able to make sure that an intervention that we undertook actually had the intended effect, and being able to allow us to drive to work on other problems, I think is going to come a much bigger thing. Helping refugees in general and migrants generally, not just in labor, but all of the sort of other ancillary services. So we're looking at other ways of looking at systems that are sometimes fragile and bolstering those systems in such a way that they actually help us address the underlying root causes. So for instance, issues around, say, land tenure claims or conflict, monitoring supply chains. This is just the beginning. I will just say to you at a very high level in closing, we're so convinced that these technologies, well, first of all, they're going to empower the powerful without question. And in our world, a common thing that's said among the people in my part of the universe is that platforms are policy and code is law. So we have to build the code that's going to allow us to drive these technologies towards first-order applications in the human rights and anti-slavery space if we hope to solve the problem of disproportionate empowerment, because we're going to empower governments and we're going to empower the private sector in ways that may super-empower them. And we have to make sure that these tools are used to empower everybody else, particularly the folks who work on this issue. So one of the things we've been working on and are going to continue to work on for the next year or so is building a distributed global human rights and anti-slavery observatory from space with a whole bunch of partner organizations, institutions, and we've been really proud of our partnering, our early partnership with Rights Lab and with Doreen and company, but we're looking to figure out how we do that in a much more comprehensive way. So if you're interested in that, please find me after, and thanks.
You want to bring up some lights? We can go ahead and put the lights back on as well. I'm going to throw out a sort of a question challenge in that I think all of us are a little mind-boggled at the size, right, and the extent and the reach and the depth of all of this imagery, all of it coming in daily, right, at so many different levels, including drone levels and so forth. And you're right, it would open up thousands and thousands of possibilities of fairly immediate interventions, or at least investigations leading to interventions. So I have to say, the thought that I immediately come to is, where are the human resources to carry that out? Right? Where are the human resources to go to the ground to carry that out? If particularly we're dealing with countries where where law enforcement doesn't work terribly well, or they themselves may want to, but they're scarce on the ground as well. We have a master's degree that we run at the University of Nottingham called the MA in Slavery and Liberation. It trains people in how to carry out the types of work to get people out of slavery, but we're generating 10, 15 graduates a year. We're going to need hundreds, thousands. Yeah, if we were to meet the boots on the ground requirements of this much observation and so forth. So that's a question that I'm throwing out as well. But let's hear other questions. Yeah, here's this guy here.
Thanks very much. I'd like to bring maybe all three of you together in one question. It's kind of a mega question. So from Austin, we heard about this iteration that observation changes behavior potentially. And then from Doreen, we saw how you can locate and count objects. And objects don't change behavior, but the people who inhabit them might, right? So there's an interaction between people and objects here. And then it seems to me that there's an interaction between people, objects, power, and wealth, which brings to your last point to bear on this. So however good the Earth observation is, humans will change what they do. And it seems to me that wealth might bring stealth, that the wealthier you are, the more you can get away with, and that, you said there'd be disproportionate empowerment, not only of governments, but also of very well-organized criminal organizations to avoid detection. So I'm just curious about that circle of interactions, which may make this work even more difficult than it is, that there's an interaction with economics, that if you know you're being observed, you find other ways of doing what you do so that you can't be detected. Kevin's often said to me, you can liberate a whole village of people, and the next day they're all working down the river somewhere else. So it's like a big balloon or an amoeba-like structure that just forms somewhere else. So I guess it's a mega question about the end state. Will any of this ever make a difference, or are we chasing something that's too difficult to catch?
Oh, I have an answer. No. As a political sociologist and a social movement scholar, speaking to a political scientist, I think, we're gonna lock eyes and we'll have a moment. But I think the answer, it comes back to politics, right? And so then the question becomes, are these, this is why it's wonderful to have these sorts of connections, because that data is only as good as it's operationalized by people who understand how that converts into politics on the ground. And so that it ends up, so then we have like a range of options. And so I think we're moving toward a moment when we can start to answer the question that Kevin just asked, which is, well, now what? And one answer is, do we take this data and not show it to anybody, but use it with sort of like shuttle diplomacy to say we know what's really happening? Or does it then go to the front page of the New York Times or the local newspaper in that particular case and use as a sort of a name and shame? But this stuff has to be, this data has to be inputs into larger like repertoires where politics and power matter, I think, which comes back to your point. And so then it's not a one size fits all. If the data's out there, then something will happen. No, it needs to be selectively applied using, as a social movement scholar, I think of one particular set of vectors and involve power and politics. And there are others that matter as well, but it will be adding it to that sort of, those existing networks where we know certain mechanisms, certain levers have worked over time.
It is an occupational hazard, I think, of any conversation about these kinds of issues that we look at. We tend to look at downside risk. And I appreciate the question that comes from understanding downside risk. It's because of what I do on a daily basis, I would like to assure you that most of what we see, and we're looking comprehensively at the things that are coming out of these kinds of systems, is mostly to the good. Overwhelmingly to the good. And so I appreciate the concern, but I also know just practically what's happening is that in the continual cat and mouse game between good people and bad people, this is a super empowering technology for good people. That I'm not being Pollyannish or like rah-rah, like I understand that there's very significant downside risks. That's why we want to build observatories that put these in the hands of people who can pay very careful and continuous attention. But let me offer just a couple of one story and one question back for you. So the story really quickly is doesn't come from geospatial Earth observation. It comes from blood donation. So I'm guessing, have most of you given blood here? Right, okay. So what do you get after you give blood? You get a cookie and a glass of juice, right? Okay, and that's pretty much it. So in Sweden, they had a huge shortage of people who were giving blood for all kinds of complicated social and cultural reasons. It just the donor base started to change, and they had to figure out some way to encourage blood donation. So they did something really interesting. When you went and you gave your pint of blood, in addition to giving you a cookie and a glass of apple juice, they took your cell phone number, and then they tracked that pint of blood through the system, and the moment it went into someone's body, you got a text that said, your blood has just gone into a human being. And that's it. All they did, they didn't give any points or money back, blah, 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 any of those kinds of things. Just people would be like, hey, look, my blood's in another human being right now, right? What have you done today, Austin? So what's interesting is that little feedback loop led to a complete reversal of the situation. Now they're a net blood exporter for all over the world because people wanted to be able to see the real-time feedback of their actions. So we look at these technologies, and I think about them in one really important respect as being able to drive those kinds of feedback loops. And so I would like to just pick up on the thread that you and Austin spoke to, which is about politics and power. I think about liberation movements. That's the world I come from, actually, prior to this work. And I think about things like the Salt Marsh, the Gandhian Salt Marsh. I think about these moments of sort of large-scale societal symbolic change. And I believe there will be leaders moral leaders of that caliber that will emerge as they do in society, who will use these tools as a way of storytelling, engagement, and as tools of political mobilization. And we already see that in some places, like around indigenous stewardship. If I have a chance, I'll show it to you. There's an amazing thing we saw around indigenous land stewardship in Brazil, where you could just watch that encroachment of deforestation, essentially all around the places where indigenous land rights had been conveyed. And just like attacking white blood cells, but they didn't manage to permeate the reserve. And you could just see the effect that occurred, and that was a powerful political tool among those indigenous land holders that they could use on their behalf. So I just want to say, I just think the story is more complicated than the unipolar potential for doom.
Questions then?
My God, we've stunned them.
Thanks. So one thing that comes often with the democratization of a tool, and I'm thinking back to the early days of the internet and the claim that was very prevalent at the time that it interprets censorship as damage and then routes around it, right? That hasn't ended up being the case, at least insofar as the internet is concerned. With examples like China, for example, is that the same technology has the potential to empower competing narratives. You could have protesters pushing one narrative and another with the same base data, just depending on how they frame it, how they present it, and that sort of thing. So I'm wondering, I'm still an optimist about this, but that's one of the things that sort of keeps me up at night when I think about the democratization of surveillance, and I'm wondering where you stand on that, the panel, and how you think that's all going to shake out.
I think that this is a concern that I think applies to technology writ large, and so I agree. And the only pushback, as I give these talks, the pushback I get tends to be from, so we documented protest size. The pushback I've gotten in that context is either we're surveilling protesters, or that we actually illuminate the small size of protests when something about the claims themselves should be enough to mobilize action. Does this make sense? So it's a performance of a certain kind of language around significance. Well, it's performing significance through numbers, right? If it's a large protest, then it really matters. But if you're a political pragmatist, that's just the fact of the thing, right? So I feel like my response to those sorts of questions, and this one, is that if these are, I hate to say this, but the Earth is going to get observed by someone, and right now it's Google, and it's the United States, and it's Russia, and it's China. And I would rather the Earth was also observed by people who shared that data with people like me. And so that will later learn to contestation and claims and debates and a whole new realm of politics in which we may agree with each other and disagree with you all. Or we may disagree with each other. And we may have competing narratives about the same objective, or competing objectives with the same narrative. That's politics. And so I think that the way that ball bounces is the way that ball bounced when Alice Seeley was in the Congo taking photographs and coming back with lantern shows. This is something that the human rights community has been doing for hundreds of years, is bringing back an evidentiary base and then fighting about it. And changing the world.
Oh, this one? Yeah. Oh, sorry. It's a really great. Sorry, I didn't know this one was over here. It's a really, really great question. There's a place to pick up on Austin's astute point about where one of the things that causes a fracturing of narratives is an epistemological problem, especially with new tools like this one, which is no one knows how to weigh the evidence, right? We're not used to looking at this kind of stuff, and it takes a long time to understand. So for example, when you go, if you were to go now and Google migrants into the U.S. with satellites. I can't remember the precise thing. I'll get you the exact thing. I did it 5 minutes before our panel because I wanted to see what else was right. One of the top stories is from Breitbart News. It's like, we have satellite images of people coming across the border. They're whole narrative thread is not my narrative thread. It's not people who are escaping, it's people who are invading, right? And that, and they've got photographs of human beings taken at high resolution because they're going at relatively late in the day and you can see their shadows, right? So suddenly it looks like, oh, these shadowy, mysterious figures are invading us, and it fits within a kind of very specific political narrative. So I think one of the things that's going to be a challenge for a while is how we ground this, and this goes to Kevin's question, which is how do we get the interpretive skills to know how to weigh this in the context of many other forms of knowledge, experience, wisdom, and other evidence. And I think that process, this is the one observation I'll make about it. You know, in chess, most of you know that AI now has beaten human beings at chess, right? That happened 20 years ago. Interestingly, now the very best chess players in the world, right, are therefore algorithms. But it turns out that the very best in the realm of chess, the very, very best way of winning at chess is through being something called a centaur. It's actually the term of art in chess, which is actually teams of human beings and teams of algorithms working together beat any human being and any algorithm, including the one that the AlphaGo algorithm that recently came out. It's what's important about there is this sort of fusing of human knowledge capacity, experience, and all this analytical capacity. And I think that's really what we have to do, is like make these tools easy to use so you can use them, so you can infuse them with the things that you know that we don't.
It's that Centaur model that's so exciting that the Rights Lab is now announcing 3 postdoctoral fellowships and 1 PhD studentship. But the eligibility is only for cybernetic organisms. So either robots themselves or AI that can apply for these. That's a...
You know, we're so close to it that I believed for a second. I was like, yeah, that's a good marketing tool right there. If your AI can get into our school, you can have a PhD.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we don't even know if AI want PhDs, but we could ask them that. Any more questions? I have a question about non-visuals, right? I mean, different wavelengths and like that. Because I have to say, as someone who's always looking out for those situations that will tell us where there are situations of enslavement, I know that if I had something that would give me this particular particulate signatures from, say, charcoal camps done in the primitive way with clay kilns and that sort of thing, that would tell me something that you could see, not in the light, but you know, and so forth. And likewise, I know you can use spectroscopic analysis from space, and I'm really keen to look at water courses that have mercury in them, which is also a telltale sign of enslaved gold mining, because they just dump mercury every which way. So if you've got anything to say about that, let's do. And any more questions out there? And we've got about 5 minutes. So just so everyone.
Okay, thank you. It's nice to get a word in, Your question, Kevin, is basically asking where we're going to have the sort of coalescence of the spectral resolution, the spatial resolution, the temporal resolution. If we can get there and maybe plan it a thinking ahead where we have, you know, the hyperspectral data where you can detect, you know, what kind of emissions you get from Earth or whether there is mercury in the water courses. We have drone technology that can do that, but you can't deploy drone technology on a daily basis. It would be very expensive to do that. You'd have to be in the locality or not. There are very, very high altitude drones. So I think we're heading in that direction where you have that, you know, coincidence of resolution, but we're not quite there yet. So it's about choosing the right system for the particular application.
Yeah, I can't comment on what's coming, but I will tell you we're just getting started. So everybody should think about this. All the stuff I just showed you is version 1, right? The one thing I will tell you is that this also, the other thing to know is that while Planet's a bit of the poster child of the moment of this, we won't for long be the only poster child of this, and there are many other really important organizations that are working on this. But one of the things that I see that's really interesting, it goes to this democratization issue, is just to pick a particular example, and it's around remote sensing of something you can't see called, it's a methane emissions. So you might remember, I don't know if any of you tracked this, but at the beginning of this particular presidential administration, and I'm not here stating anything about them, they are very hostile to climate observation, generally using the tools that NASA and NOAA and others have at their disposal. So they said we're going to shut them all down. And the then governor of California said, well, if they do that, we're going to build our own damn satellites. So this was the non-federal level. It was starting to move down to the state, and partly they could have that conversation because it's getting cheaper to do. And we went, hello? And so Jerry Brown and Planet got together, and we were actually building with our friends at JPL a hyper-resolution methane sat that's specifically designed for monitoring methane emissions at the point source. And that's just the beginning. So if you do it for methane, then you're doing it outside of the visible spectrum. Then you're doing it for, eventually what'll happen is all the things that are on your wish list, Kevin, I think will be here in the next few years.
Yes, here we are.
I think a challenge every single one of us faces is a sort of follow the money issue. If you're a nonprofit, you can do only what a funder will pay for. If you're a public corporation, you have to do what maximizes value for shareholders legally in the United States. So I wonder if you guys have suggestions or maybe even anecdotes of how that motivation either has shaped or has not shaped what you've done. If it hasn't shaped what you've done, can you give others in the room ideas for how to get away from that influence and do what you think is best for the world?
Okay, I would love to hear from others on that subject, but let me just offer my own quick 2 cents, which is that the current model we have of relationship between funders and the nonprofit sector seems to me, and I spent many years in it, like the relationship between drug dealers and drug users. So high dependency, if you don't need the product, the cash, then you're not quite as interested in what they had for breakfast as you might be if you really need them to show up and actually keep the situation afloat. And I think many nonprofits are anorexically funded, and they, as a consequence, are using 19th century tools often to solve 21st century problems. And it's acutely difficult in this circumstance because so many of the issues we're working around slavery and trafficking are so intimate. They're up close and personal. We heard our friend from ASU talking about the journey of that young 15-year-old girl to Las Vegas, and that's not a story you observe from space, and using AI at least historically. So the thing about these tools, though, is that I think that fully embraced, they can allow nonprofits to be substantially more efficient and more effective and to have much greater reach than they have historically had. And in order to convince, what we really have to do is convince the funding ecosystem, and that's actually the place we've decided to invest, is to say we'll work with a bunch of nonprofits who are working on indigenous land rights in Kenya and who are working on monitoring the trafficking of people across the Mediterranean, out of Syria, and all the other kinds of examples that I showed you. But really what we want to do is go and say, now you need to fund 21st century institutions that have they're nonprofit mission-led institutions to do these things. And those institutions, I'm not saying you're from the nonprofit sector, but if you were, have to be prepared to be a different kind of entity. Like, you need to have more of certain kinds of people and probably less of others than you have historically had. So there's a systems change inside of you, a kind of metabolic change inside nonprofits. There's a metabolic change and a sensibility change inside the funders. And we've decided to start with the funders to try and say, this is what one of these organizations looks like. That's the reason we work with HRW, we work with Human Rights Watch. What's interesting is we gave them all of access to this ubiquitously. And what we're finding is they're hiring certain kinds of people, and they're not hiring other kinds of people, and they're achieving that next kind of homeostatic form. And the reason we can say, okay, this is what it looks like when you actually do it. This is the kinds of staff and the kinds of tools and how you recruit and how much you pay them to do the work. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what we're trying to encourage a systems change there.
So, sorry, when you work with a nonprofit, they get funding to basically act on the data that you give them. It's not that you're funding.
Yeah, we're not funders, but what we're trying to do is convince the funders that this is effective as a tool and should be funded and has holistic implications for the way the organization operates and is staffed and measures its success, et cetera. And we've had really good success thus far with a couple of organizations watching them go through this transition when they have access to this.
Maybe let's follow that up if you need to, but we've hit our time limit. But I got to throw in that, of course, if governments were doing their jobs, or we expected governments to do things like human rights and protect our environments, then we wouldn't need to be having so many conversations about anorexic NGOs. Right? So I just had to say, I'm sorry, I had to say that. Thank you to our amazing panel. Thank you to our amazing participants and delegates. I had a lot of fun. Everyone have a nice break, and we'll come back in a bit.